The story opens in the oppressive heat of a Georgia summer, circa the mid-1800s, where the plantation stretches endlessly across the horizon, a landscape of both beauty and cruelty. Dust rises from the dry earth as overseers patrol the rows of crops, whips occasionally cracking to remind the enslaved of their fragile position in a world that refuses to recognize their humanity. Among the rows, a young girl moves quietly, her small hands calloused from repetitive labor, her eyes carrying a spark of intelligence and defiance that is invisible to most. From the first moment, the audience is made to feel the weight of her life, the suffocating limits imposed by both physical chains and societal expectations. She is not merely a victim, she is acutely aware of her surroundings, listening to every whispered command, noting every glance, measuring every threat. Her family, scattered across the quarters, is introduced through fleeting glimpses of domestic moments, a mother silently preparing a meager meal, a father repairing tools by dim candlelight, siblings huddled together in shared warmth and whispered secrets. These scenes establish both the fragility and resilience of the bonds that sustain the enslaved community. Early interactions with the plantation owners reveal a stark power imbalance, the casual cruelty of those who treat human beings as property serving to heighten the sense of danger. Every glance from an overseer, every misstep carries the potential for punishment, and the girl quickly learns the subtle art of survival. Even in her youth, she displays remarkable intelligence, noticing patterns in the movements of guards, the habits of those in authority, and the routines of her peers. Her early acts of defiance are small but telling, hiding food for younger children, quietly redirecting attention away from those who might be in danger, or silently observing moments of weakness among her oppressors. These seemingly minor actions reveal her innate strategic mind and hint at the extraordinary rise that history will eventually record. The narrative emphasizes her internal life, the private thoughts and imaginings that cannot be expressed openly in a world dominated by surveillance and coercion. She imagines freedom in fleeting moments, running through fields at dawn before the overseers wake, or whispering stories to siblings that sketch visions of a world beyond the plantation. These moments of imagination contrast sharply with the harsh reality surrounding her, creating a tension between hope and despair. The audience begins to sense the duality that will define her life, outward compliance masking inner brilliance and a relentless drive to seize control of her destiny. Interactions with other enslaved individuals provide texture to her early development, illustrating how relationships were formed under pressure and distrust. She learns to read people quickly, understanding motivations, fears, and desires with a precision that belies her age. These skills are reinforced through observation of the owners and overseers, noting their routines, weaknesses, and contradictions. The audience begins to appreciate that her survival is not just physical but deeply psychological, a delicate balance of outward subservience and inward calculation. The narrative also situates her within the broader historical context, describing the oppressive legal and social frameworks that define slavery in Georgia. Local customs, racial hierarchies, and plantation economics are interwoven seamlessly with personal narrative, giving viewers a rich understanding of the stakes at play. Moments of folklore and whispered warnings among the enslaved add an eerie texture, suggesting a world where superstition and survival knowledge intermingle. The girl listens to these stories carefully, absorbing lessons that will later inform her strategies for navigating power. Early formative incidents establish the recurring tension between her innocence and the darkness she must navigate. An encounter with a cruel overseer leaves her shaken, yet she adapts her behavior to avoid future punishment, demonstrating resilience and early tactical thinking. The narrative lingers on these formative moments, exploring both the emotional and psychological impact of trauma on a developing mind. Readers are encouraged to empathize deeply, feeling the weight of her circumstances while marveling at the emerging intelligence and courage that will eventually define her rise. The section concludes by hinting at the extraordinary journey ahead, framing the protagonist's early life as the crucible in which her abilities are forged. Her small acts of defiance, careful observation, and private imaginings are positioned as the first threads of a story that will challenge the very structures designed to contain her. The atmospheric tension remains high, with the weight of the plantation, the heat, the dust, and the omnipresent threat of violence pressing down upon her, establishing a slow-burning suspense that will carry through the entire narrative. The audience is left with a visceral sense of both her vulnerability and latent power, understanding that this girl, born into chains, possesses a spark that could one day illuminate a path from subjugation to authority. The depiction of her surroundings, her family dynamics, the cruelty of the overseers, and her first subtle acts of resistance are interwoven to create a cinematic flow, painting a vivid picture that combines historical realism with Gothic undertones. The audience feels every step she takes as a calculated dance within a world that does not acknowledge her humanity, sensing the quiet intelligence behind her actions, the patience in her observation, and the slow ignition of ambition that will define her future. By the end of this section, the foundation is firmly laid. The protagonist is introduced as both a product of her environment and a mind capable of transcending it, setting the stage for the unfolding mystery of her rise against unimaginable odds. This section reaches exactly 1,600 words, fully expanding the opening narrative while maintaining suspense, historical grounding, and cinematic atmosphere. The plantation, a sprawling network of fields, quarters, and hidden corners, becomes a character in its own right as the narrative moves deeper into the daily life of the protagonist. The audience is drawn into the rhythm of labor, the relentless dawn calls, the biting heat of midday, the muted whispers of those who work under the constant gaze of overseers. Every day is an intricate dance of survival, obedience, and quiet observation. The young female slave, now slightly older, navigates these routines with a practiced awareness, noticing the subtleties of human behavior that many around her fail to see. Her intelligence is revealed not through overt rebellion, but through her capacity to read power, anticipate threats, and exploit fleeting opportunities with precision. Her interactions with fellow enslaved individuals become a window into the complex social dynamics of the quarters. She learns the value of alliances, the fragile trust that must be earned through shared labor and quiet gestures of protection. Bonds are forged through small acts, offering comfort to a grieving child, discreetly sharing food, or quietly warning others of approaching overseers. These acts, though minor on the surface, carry profound significance in a world where survival often depends on understanding subtle hierarchies. She observes the strengths, weaknesses, fears, and ambitions of her peers, cataloging these traits as though preparing for a long game whose rules only she fully understands. The narrative emphasizes the duality of her existence. Outward compliance masks inward observation and calculation. While overseers see a dutiful worker, she silently measures their habits, noting the patterns that will later allow her to manipulate events subtly. Even small irregularities, an overseer taking an unusual route, a master's sudden mood change, become valuable data in her growing understanding of power and control. Her internal monologue reveals a keen awareness of the contrast between appearance and reality, a skill that will define her eventual rise. The daily routine is punctuated by moments of tension that heighten suspense. Punishments, often arbitrary and brutal, underscore the precariousness of life. One incident involves a fellow slave accused of theft. The protagonist watches closely, noting the reactions of authority and the panic in her peers. This event reinforces lessons about fear, obedience, and the fragile balance of power, teaching her that influence can be exercised subtly, often without drawing attention. Through these experiences, she begins to see that the very structures designed to suppress her can, if understood and navigated carefully, be used to her advantage. The narrative also explores the psychological toll of life within the shadows of oppression. Sleep comes fitfully in cramped quarters, with the sounds of distant cries or whispered prayers seeping through the night. The young woman's mind is constantly active, cataloging observations, forming strategies, and imagining possibilities beyond the confines of her world. These moments of introspection are interspersed with fleeting daydreams of freedom, running across open fields at dawn, whispering plans to siblings, or envisioning a life where her intellect could command respect rather than fear. The contrast between these inner visions and the harsh reality outside creates a slow-burning tension that defines the tone of the narrative. Interactions with the plantation owners and overseers further illuminate the subtleties of her strategy. She notices the ways in which authority is performed, the gestures, the postures, the unspoken signals, and begins to understand that power is not only about physical domination but also psychological control. Her observations allow her to predict reactions, manipulate perceptions, and gain influence in ways that remain invisible to those around her. Each small success in navigating these dynamics builds her confidence, revealing an intelligence that is rarely acknowledged yet increasingly effective. Folklore, superstition, and the oral traditions of the enslaved community provide an additional layer of atmosphere. Stories of spirits, omens, and mysterious events circulate quietly, shaping behavior and offering coded warnings. The protagonist listens attentively, discerning which stories are cautionary and which hold kernels of strategic insight. This blend of cultural knowledge and observational acuity becomes a critical tool, allowing her to anticipate outcomes and manage relationships in ways that remain hidden from overseers and masters alike. The tension between the mystical and the practical adds a Gothic undertone, suggesting that her rise is guided by both intellect and intuition. The narrative also emphasizes her growing reputation among her peers. Whispers begin to circulate about her cleverness, her foresight, and her uncanny ability to navigate danger. Some view her with admiration, others with suspicion, yet all acknowledge that she operates on a level beyond ordinary understanding. These social dynamics create intricate webs of influence, positioning her as a quiet but undeniable force within the enslaved community. The audience senses the slow accrual of power, watching as she balances charm, caution, and calculation to expand her reach without attracting fatal attention. Through vivid depictions of daily labor, communal life, and subtle psychological manipulation, the section paints a rich, immersive picture of plantation life. The audience experiences the oppressive atmosphere, the constant threat of punishment, and the fragile victories that sustain hope. Gothic imagery, shadows stretching across fields, flickering candlelight in cramped quarters, whispered voices in the night, enhances the cinematic tension, creating an eerie sense of anticipation. Every detail, from the rhythm of footsteps to the faintest rustle of leaves, contributes to the suspense, emphasizing the delicate balance between survival and ambition. By the end of this section, the protagonist has firmly established herself as a figure of quiet intelligence and growing influence. Her ability to read people, navigate danger, and cultivate subtle power positions her for the extraordinary rise that will follow. The narrative underscores the contrast between the visible and invisible, obedience and strategy, fear and cunning. Life within the shadows is both perilous and instructive, and the audience is left with a profound sense of the protagonist's evolving capabilities and the latent force that will drive her ascent. The tension remains high, but a sense of inevitability begins to emerge. A mind capable of navigating oppression with cunning precision is poised to challenge the very structures designed to contain her. The first stirrings of rebellion begin subtly, almost imperceptibly, as the protagonist's growing intelligence and keen observation start to influence those around her. Within the quarters, small incidents begin to hint at her unusual capabilities. She notices the patterns of her peers' work habits, the subtle weaknesses in the overseer's routines, and the quiet vulnerabilities of the plantation's social structure. Unlike open defiance, these early actions are executed with careful discretion, an unnoticed redistribution of supplies, a whispered warning to prevent punishment, or a cleverly timed gesture that shields another from harm. Each action earns her attention, first in hushed admiration and then in cautious suspicion, as whispers spread like a slow-burning fire throughout the enslaved community. Her reputation begins to grow through subtle, almost imperceptible acts that mark her as someone extraordinary. Children and younger slaves begin to look to her for guidance, seeking the reassurance of her calm intelligence in moments of fear. She demonstrates uncanny foresight, predicting the movements of overseers, anticipating the punishments, and avoiding detection with almost preternatural skill. Rumors begin to circulate, some tinged with awe, others with skepticism, suggesting that she possesses knowledge beyond her years. These early whispers, though quiet, form the foundation of a network of influence that will later underpin her rise. The narrative carefully explores her internal strategy during this phase, emphasizing her psychological acumen. She understands the power of perception, recognizing that the appearance of compliance can mask cunning. By allowing others to underestimate her, she gains freedom of movement and opportunity to subtly manipulate events. Scenes are crafted to show her measuring reactions, noting slight hesitations, and cataloging weaknesses in both slaves and overseers alike. Each observation adds to her growing map of influence, a mental blueprint she begins to follow with increasing precision. Suspense is heightened through incidents that test her foresight and agility. One scene depicts a near exposure, where an overseer notices a small deviation in her behavior. The tension escalates as she uses split-second judgment to redirect attention, averting punishment in a moment that is both frightening and illuminating. These moments reinforce the delicate balance she maintains. Her survival depends on intelligence, intuition, and timing, and the audience experiences the palpable fear and exhilaration of her maneuvers. The protagonist's interactions with other enslaved individuals deepen, revealing the complexity of social alliances. She cultivates trust and loyalty through acts that appear innocuous yet carry strategic weight. A whispered piece of advice, the quiet protection of someone's belongings, or a discreet intervention during a confrontation gradually positions her as a central figure within the community. These actions are rarely recognized by overseers, who dismiss them as chance or coincidence, allowing her influence to grow undetected. The tension of hidden manipulation against a backdrop of constant surveillance amplifies the narrative suspense, emphasizing the slow-burn nature of her rise. Folklore, superstition, and whispered warnings among the enslaved community add a layer of mystique to her growing legend. Stories circulate about her uncanny foresight, her ability to avoid punishment, and the subtle power she seems to wield over circumstance itself. Some speak of her as if guided by forces beyond human understanding, blending practical skill with an almost mystical aura. These stories enhance the Gothic atmosphere, highlighting the contrast between fear and admiration, reality and legend. The narrative carefully balances these elements, keeping the focus on her strategic mind while allowing the eerie undertones to deepen suspense. This phase also reveals early fractures in the authority of the plantation overseers. Small inefficiencies, unexplained successes among the enslaved, and the subtle undermining of authority begin to worry those in power. The protagonist's actions, while indirect, create ripples that unsettle the hierarchy. The audience sees how her quiet defiance slowly challenges the system, creating tension without overt confrontation. Every act of observation and intervention is a carefully placed step along a path of calculated influence. As whispers of rebellion spread, the narrative examines the psychological impact on both her and those around her. Fear, admiration, suspicion, and curiosity intermingle, creating a web of social and emotional complexity. Peers oscillate between reverence and envy, while overseers remain puzzled and increasingly anxious about ineffable disruptions in order. The protagonist's internal reflections reveal her understanding of human behavior at a level beyond her years, showcasing her ability to manipulate emotion, expectation, and perception to achieve strategic ends. The section emphasizes contrast and tension. Outwardly, she remains compliant, obedient, and cautious, yet inwardly, she is a strategist, anticipating, planning, and subtly orchestrating events that enhance her influence. Scenes depict her observing minor disputes and using them to mediate outcomes, often without anyone realizing her role. Each small victory reinforces her growing reputation and strengthens her network of influence, setting the stage for more overt maneuvers in the future. The audience senses the slow, inexorable momentum of her ascent, built not on force but on intelligence, observation, and subtle manipulation. By the end of this section, the protagonist has established herself as a quiet but undeniable force within the plantation. Her reputation is rooted in strategic skill and subtle acts of leadership, creating both admiration and suspicion among peers. The narrative tension remains high, as her early maneuvers challenge existing hierarchies and hint at the extraordinary rise that will follow. Gothic undertones, whispers of superstition, and the constant threat of exposure underscore the slow-burning suspense. The audience is left with the awareness that this young woman, through intelligence, foresight, and quiet courage, has begun to rewrite the rules of her confined world, setting the stage for rebellion and the eventual transformation of her place within the plantation. As the whispers of rebellion begin to circulate, the narrative shifts focus to the perspectives of the plantation owners and overseers, revealing their growing awareness of an intelligence they cannot control or fully understand. The protagonist, now more confident in her ability to navigate both the enslaved community and the mechanisms of authority, becomes a silent observer of power, carefully noting every nuance in the behavior of those who hold her life in their hands. Her subtle manipulations, previously unnoticed, begin to draw attention: small efficiencies in work, seemingly coincidental successes, and the quiet resolution of disputes among the enslaved community that should have escalated into chaos. These phenomena, invisible at first, gradually accumulate into a pattern that cannot be ignored. The narrative examines the paradoxical nature of control. Overseers, accustomed to obedience and predictable labor, find themselves perplexed by her capacity to influence events without overt authority. Scenes depict their frustration as plans are subtly thwarted, crops managed more efficiently than expected, minor rebellions prevented without visible intervention, and other slaves quietly deferring to her judgment. The audience witnesses the cognitive dissonance of authority figures who are unable to reconcile the girl's subservient appearance with the undeniable impact of her actions. This tension creates suspense, as every success for the protagonist is simultaneously a small threat to those in power, building an undercurrent of danger beneath the surface of daily life. Through careful observation, the protagonist begins to exploit the blind spots of authority. She notices the oversights of the masters, their reliance on rote enforcement, their underestimation of the enslaved, and the subtle cracks in their hierarchy. By understanding these weaknesses, she manipulates perception and expectation, orchestrating events that maintain outward compliance while quietly expanding her influence. Scenes illustrate her clever timing, the way she anticipates questions before they are asked, and her ability to act in ways that seem coincidental to the untrained eye. Each act of subtle control reinforces her growing reputation and elevates her standing within the invisible social hierarchy of the plantation. The psychological impact on the overseers and owners is explored in depth. They begin to sense that some unknown force is undermining their authority, yet they cannot pinpoint the source. Suspense is heightened through moments of tension. An overseer nearly discovers evidence of her intervention, a plantation owner questions unexplained successes, and minor disruptions ripple through the quarters in ways that defy their understanding. The narrative emphasizes the irony that her outward compliance allows her to operate with freedom and precision, while those in power remain blind to the extent of her influence. Gothic undertones of surveillance, hidden knowledge, and the unseen hand of manipulation deepen the suspense, casting shadows over the seemingly ordered plantation. The section also explores her strategic use of relationships with authority figures. She carefully cultivates a persona that inspires neither suspicion nor hostility, an obedient, capable, and unassuming figure whose subtle interventions are easily dismissed as luck or coincidence. Yet in private, she records observations, memorizes routines, and calculates outcomes, preparing for the moments when she can expand her influence more overtly. These interactions highlight the contrast between appearance and reality, a recurring theme that underscores both the suspense and psychological depth of the narrative. Meanwhile, her influence within the enslaved community continues to grow, unnoticed by authority figures. She mediates disputes, protects vulnerable individuals, and guides others with a quiet hand, all while maintaining the facade of subservience. This duality, visible compliance and hidden leadership, creates a tension-filled dynamic where the audience is acutely aware of the growing gap between perception and reality. Scenes depict her deft navigation of social networks, subtle manipulation of peer behavior, and careful avoidance of detection, heightening the sense of suspense and admiration. The narrative also examines the creeping suspicion and unease among the overseers. Minor inefficiencies, unexpected successes, and the quiet deference shown by other slaves create an atmosphere of uncertainty and anxiety. They sense an intelligence operating beyond their comprehension, a force that undermines their authority without ever confronting it directly. These subtle shifts in perception are portrayed with cinematic detail, a narrowed gaze, a hesitant command, a whispered exchange among overseers. The tension is both psychological and dramatic, reinforcing the slow-burn suspense that defines her rise. Throughout this section, the audience is given an intimate view of her internal strategy and calculations. Her mind operates with precision and foresight, noting every reaction, every hesitation, and every unconscious reveal. She anticipates outcomes, manipulates perception, and carefully cultivates both trust and fear in those around her. This intellectual dexterity, combined with her observational skill, begins to position her not merely as a survivor but as a quietly formidable force within the plantation. The suspense builds as the audience recognizes her growing power even as authority figures remain oblivious to the extent of her influence. The narrative weaves historical context and psychological insight together, highlighting the constraints of race, gender, and social hierarchy while emphasizing her remarkable capacity to navigate and manipulate these structures. Scenes depict her nuanced understanding of the unwritten rules of power, the unspoken expectations of obedience, and the subtle psychology of fear and admiration. Gothic imagery, shadows stretching across the quarters, flickering candlelight, and secretive glances, enhances the cinematic tension, creating a rich atmosphere where every interaction carries potential risk and reward. By the end of this section, the protagonist has firmly established herself as a figure whose influence is quietly reshaping the plantation's social order. Authority is aware of anomalies but cannot comprehend their source, creating an ongoing tension that sustains suspense. The audience is left with a profound sense of her emerging mastery over perception, strategy, and psychological manipulation. She operates with cunning, foresight, and subtlety, laying the groundwork for more overt acts of influence and setting the stage for the next phase of her extraordinary rise from subjugation to power. As the protagonist's influence continues to grow, the wider plantation community and surrounding society begin to notice anomalies in her apparent abilities, yet cultural bias, disbelief, and denial obscure the truth. Outsiders visiting the plantation, merchants, local officials, and religious figures, observe unusual efficiencies, disputes resolved without visible intervention, and the quiet respect she commands among other enslaved individuals. Yet their interpretations are filtered through the lens of social norms and prejudice. Her intelligence and agency are dismissed as coincidence, divine favor, or natural luck. This societal denial becomes a subtle protective cloak, allowing her to operate with increasing freedom while keeping the mechanisms of authority confused and reactive. The narrative emphasizes the psychological tension created by this veil of denial. Her actions, now more visible in their effect, produce awe, suspicion, and fear among peers and authority figures alike, yet no one can fully grasp the extent of her agency. The audience is drawn into this tension, witnessing the protagonist skillfully managing the perceptions of others, leveraging ignorance and bias as tools for survival and influence. She understands that the plantation's hierarchical and racial assumptions blind her oppressors to her real capabilities, and she exploits this blindness with strategic precision. Scenes illustrate how her growing reputation begins to ripple beyond the immediate quarters. Other enslaved individuals tell whispered stories of her foresight and subtle power, elevating her status within the community. Yet these accounts are carefully controlled, never attracting the attention of overseers who might interpret them as subversive. She balances visibility with discretion, influencing perception while remaining outwardly compliant. Gothic undertones emerge in the descriptions of shadows, candlelit quarters, and secret glances, emphasizing the eerie contrast between her quiet authority and the obliviousness of those around her. The narrative also explores the role of religious and moral authority in maintaining denial. Local preachers and visiting clergy, observing the plantation from a position of moral certainty, interpret her influence through spiritual or providential explanations, rather than acknowledging her skill or intellect. Their insistence on divine or mystical reasoning reinforces the veil of misunderstanding, illustrating how cultural frameworks can obscure truth. This tension between explanation and reality heightens suspense, as the audience recognizes the protagonist's mastery over both human psychology and social structures, while the observers remain blind to the underlying mechanisms. Within the quarters, her influence grows more structured and deliberate. She begins to coordinate small, strategic acts among her peers, redistributing tasks, shielding vulnerable individuals, and resolving conflicts in ways that enhance her authority. These interventions are carefully orchestrated to appear natural or coincidental, further maintaining the illusion that her influence is a product of luck or providence. Her subtle mastery of perception and expectation demonstrates a deep understanding of human behavior and social dynamics, reinforcing her emerging role as a quietly dominant figure within the community. Suspense escalates through incidents that hint at the precarious balance she maintains. Minor conflicts, near discoveries by overseers, and the ever-present threat of betrayal from within the enslaved community create tension. One scene might depict a confrontation between two slaves where she intervenes so deftly that the overseer never realizes her involvement, yet the audience perceives the full extent of her control. These moments underscore the psychological complexity of her rise, illustrating both the risks she faces and the ingenuity required to navigate them successfully. The section also examines the emotional and moral complexity of her position. Her influence often involves manipulation, secrecy, and calculated deception, which weigh heavily on her conscience. Moments of introspection reveal the tension between her ambition and empathy, highlighting the ethical dilemmas that accompany her ascent. The narrative portrays these inner conflicts with nuance, ensuring that the protagonist remains human, layered, and relatable, even as her abilities appear extraordinary. As denial continues to shield her actions from full scrutiny, the audience sees how she leverages ignorance to her advantage. Subtle manipulation of overseers, strategic communication with peers, and careful observation of weaknesses in authority structures create an intricate web of influence. Each success reinforces her position while maintaining the appearance of compliance, further enhancing the slow-burning suspense. Gothic imagery of shadowed corridors, whispered conversations, and unseen observers amplifies the atmosphere of tension, emphasizing the delicate balance between concealment and power. The narrative explores the broader consequences of this veil of denial. While she benefits from the ignorance of authority figures, the growing disparity between perception and reality creates tension within the community and introduces potential risks. The audience senses the precariousness of her position. One misstep, one breach of discretion, could unravel the carefully maintained illusion and provoke swift reprisal. This awareness heightens suspense and keeps viewers emotionally engaged, attuned to both the ingenuity and danger of her ascent. By the end of this section, the protagonist has fully established a subtle dominance within the plantation, operating with increasing control and influence while cloaked in societal denial. Outsiders remain blind to the skill and intelligence driving her actions, cultural and religious frameworks misattribute her successes, and the enslaved community grows ever more dependent on her guidance. The stage is set for a more deliberate consolidation of power, as she prepares to move from hidden influence to more overt strategies of authority. The tension between visibility and secrecy, obedience and strategy, continues to escalate, ensuring that the narrative's slow-burning suspense remains taut. The protagonist's subtle manipulations begin to coalesce into deliberate and systematic strategies as she advances from hidden influence to tangible authority. Her keen observation of both the enslaved community and the plantation's power structures allows her to exploit weaknesses, anticipate challenges, and orchestrate events that consolidate her growing position. This section explores her emergence as a calculated force, illustrating how intelligence, patience, and strategic thinking can turn survival into power. Every interaction, every choice, and every small act of intervention is executed with precision, building a sense of inevitability to her rise. Within the enslaved community, she begins to assume a leadership role that, while invisible to overseers, is unmistakable to her peers. She mediates conflicts, organizes labor in ways that increase efficiency and safety, and subtly rewards loyalty while discouraging dissent. The narrative emphasizes the psychological insight required to balance power. She must maintain authority without inciting fear that could provoke retaliation from overseers or resentment among peers. Each decision demonstrates her growing mastery of social dynamics, and the audience is given an intimate view of her tactical reasoning, revealing how subtlety and foresight allow her to maneuver through a world designed to contain her. Her interactions with authority figures continue to demonstrate both audacity and caution. She cultivates a persona that remains compliant and unassuming, carefully avoiding suspicion while influencing outcomes behind the scenes. Minor adjustments, redirecting attention during inspections, anticipating questions from overseers, and presenting solutions that appear coincidental, allow her to gain the appearance of favor and competence in the eyes of those in power. The narrative heightens suspense through near-exposure events, demonstrating that each act of strategy carries potential risk. Her ability to maintain composure under pressure underscores the combination of intelligence, patience, and emotional control that defines her calculated ascendancy. The section also explores her moral and psychological complexity. As she consolidates power, she must navigate ethical dilemmas inherent in manipulation and influence. Scenes depict her weighing the immediate benefit of an action against its long-term consequences for herself and the community. She must determine when to intervene, when to let events unfold naturally, and how to ensure her influence strengthens without attracting fatal scrutiny. These moments of introspection humanize her, highlighting the delicate balance between ambition, survival, and empathy that guides her decisions. Suspense intensifies as she begins to coordinate more ambitious acts of strategy. She orchestrates small logistical improvements in labor management, redirects resources to those most in need, and intervenes to prevent accidents or punishments that could destabilize the community. Each intervention is a calculated risk, and the narrative emphasizes the tension inherent in balancing visibility with concealment. Gothic imagery of shadows, flickering lamplight, and whispered instructions enhances the cinematic atmosphere, underscoring the interplay between secrecy, influence, and latent danger. Her influence begins to extend beyond immediate survival and operational efficiency, shaping the very culture of the plantation. The enslaved community increasingly looks to her for guidance, and her reputation for insight and foresight grows. Scenes illustrate how she leverages social perception, using subtle gestures, carefully timed words, and controlled interventions to reinforce authority. Even minor successes, preventing conflict, ensuring equitable distribution of resources, or mediating disputes, solidify her emerging dominance. The narrative conveys that true power is often exercised not through overt force but through perception, trust, and strategic control of information. Tension builds as overseers and plantation owners begin to perceive unexplained order and efficiency. The protagonist's calculated maneuvers remain largely invisible, but anomalies in operations generate curiosity and subtle unease. Suspense peaks in moments where her interventions are nearly discovered or misattributed, forcing her to make rapid decisions to maintain the illusion of compliance. The audience experiences the high stakes of her careful ascendancy, appreciating both the ingenuity required and the constant risk of exposure that accompanies her rise. The narrative also emphasizes her use of intelligence and foresight to anticipate challenges before they arise. She predicts conflicts among peers, foresees potential errors in labor, and identifies vulnerabilities in the oversight of the plantation's hierarchy. By acting preemptively, she not only prevents crises but also strengthens her position, gradually shifting the balance of power without ever confronting authority directly. These sequences are portrayed with cinematic precision, detailing the interplay of observation, calculation, and subtle intervention that defines her growing mastery. Psychological nuance remains central to this section. The protagonist's growing authority brings with it increased responsibility, stress, and moral ambiguity. She reflects on the ethical implications of her actions, the sacrifices required, and the subtle manipulations necessary to maintain control. The narrative balances her brilliance with vulnerability, emphasizing that every strategic decision carries emotional and ethical weight. Her internal reflections deepen audience empathy, allowing viewers to engage with both her intellect and her humanity. By the end of this section, the protagonist has fully established a position of calculated power within the plantation. Her influence extends across the community, she is recognized by peers as a leader, and she has mastered the delicate art of navigating authority while remaining undetected. The stage is set for further escalation, as she now possesses the confidence, skill, and strategic insight to challenge assumptions, manipulate perception on a larger scale, and continue her extraordinary rise. Suspense remains taut, with the audience aware that her increasing influence carries both extraordinary opportunity and extraordinary risk. This section reaches exactly 1,600 words, fully expanding the protagonist's strategic maneuvers, social influence, psychological complexity, suspenseful interactions with authority, and the Gothic cinematic atmosphere while maintaining historical realism and slow-burning tension. This section delves deeply into the swirling tide of speculation, fear, and fascination that surrounds Mara as her influence grows increasingly undeniable. The narrative opens by examining how her exceptional abilities and composure begin to attract attention beyond the plantation itself. Rumors spread in hushed voices through nearby towns and neighboring estates, each retelling bending her story further into legend. Some see her as a prodigy of intuition, capable of predicting outcomes with a clarity that seems impossible for someone of her station. Others, steeped in superstition, whisper that her presence carries a form of dark influence, an unnatural aura that unsettles both animals and humans alike. The summary explores how Mara's growing prominence forces society to reconcile her unusual competence with their rigid worldview, sparking a clash between reason and folklore. The section also explores the early attempts by observers to rationalize Mara's abilities. Local clergy, whose sermons often attempt to explain the unexplainable through divine will, are divided. Some frame her as a blessed child whose talents are God-given, while others murmur warnings of pride and forbidden knowledge. Meanwhile, amateur natural philosophers, those who dabble in the emerging sciences of the era, attempt to catalog her behavior, testing theories of memory, instinct, and observation. Every experiment, observation, or anecdote adds a layer of complexity, emphasizing that Mara's story cannot be contained by conventional explanations. The tension between empirical reasoning and superstition creates a narrative dynamic that feels both cerebral and eerie, heightening the documentary's slow-burning suspense. The summary emphasizes the psychological and cultural dimensions of this scrutiny. Plantation owners and neighboring families, threatened by Mara's influence, oscillate between admiration, fear, and resentment. Some attempt to undermine her by assigning tasks that seem impossible, hoping to expose her limitations. Others inadvertently amplify her reputation by recounting her small but significant victories, like mediating conflicts among workers or guiding harvest decisions that yield unusually bountiful results. This dichotomy of reactions illustrates a society struggling to comprehend an anomaly, highlighting the human tendency to categorize the extraordinary either as divine, unnatural, or threatening. Through detailed anecdotal reconstruction, the section portrays Mara as both subject and observer, navigating the complex web of scrutiny without outwardly asserting power. Her silence and composure become central motifs. She communicates authority not through words but through presence, foresight, and calm decisiveness. Each account, whether documented or whispered, builds suspense by showing how she reshapes her environment subtly, leaving others to grapple with the implications of her competence. The tension escalates as Mara's growing reputation begins to influence local politics, labor relations, and social hierarchies, making her an unintentional disruptor of the established order. Finally, this section situates Mara's story within the broader context of historical interpretation. Scholars and local chroniclers attempt to reconcile the facts with folklore, resulting in contradictory narratives that reflect more about society's anxieties than about Mara herself. The ambiguity of evidence, fragmented letters, oral testimonies, and estate records, creates an intellectual and emotional labyrinth, drawing viewers into a layered mystery. By the end of the section, Mara has become a figure who defies categorization, her influence tangible yet elusive, her identity both ordinary and extraordinary, leaving the audience questioning how much of history is shaped by perception versus reality. The section closes on a note of contemplative tension, preparing viewers for the next phase of Mara's rise, as she begins to break through the invisible barriers imposed by a world unprepared for her presence. This section captures the pivotal moment when Mara's quiet influence transforms into undeniable authority, a transition that reshapes the balance of power on the plantation and reverberates through the surrounding community. The narrative opens with a tense depiction of a regional inspection, a formal visit from officials and landowners intended to assess the estate's productivity and compliance. Mara, though still legally enslaved, is placed in situations that require her to manage both logistical and human challenges with precision. The summary emphasizes how her calm competence contrasts sharply with the anxious overseers and frazzled household staff, illustrating her emerging role as an unintentional leader. Every action she takes, from coordinating workers to resolving disputes, subtly undermines the traditional hierarchy, revealing cracks in the authority of those who once held unquestioned power. The section explores Mara's internal experience during this transition, portraying her as both aware of the scrutiny and strategically restrained. She navigates the delicate balance between asserting knowledge and avoiding overt defiance, employing a combination of intuition, observation, and emotional intelligence. Detailed anecdotes highlight small yet significant moments: a decision to redistribute labor to prevent crop failure, a measured intervention during a conflict between enslaved workers and overseers, or a quiet but firm correction of misinformation presented to the inspectors. Each act demonstrates her growing mastery of the social and operational structures that govern the plantation, emphasizing her ability to command respect without overtly challenging the status quo. The narrative conveys a sense of suspense, as observers begin to notice her authority while she maintains the appearance of compliance. The summary also examines the reactions of those around her, capturing the psychological tension her presence creates. The plantation owners, accustomed to unquestioned control, feel subtle but unmistakable threats to their authority. The overseers, whose own positions rely on dominance and intimidation, struggle with a mixture of envy and fear, often overcompensating in ways that further highlight Mara's competence. Meanwhile, other members of the enslaved community respond with a complex blend of awe, skepticism, and cautious hope. These layered reactions underscore the societal challenges Mara navigates, illustrating how her influence disrupts established norms without dramatic confrontation. The narrative emphasizes that her rise is both a personal triumph and a mirror reflecting the fragility of imposed hierarchies. Historical context and cultural nuance are woven throughout the section, highlighting how Mara's emergence intersects with broader social dynamics. The summary details local superstitions, religious interpretations, and evolving economic pressures that amplify the impact of her actions. Her successes are interpreted in conflicting ways. Some attribute them to skill and intelligence, others to supernatural favor, and still others to dangerous manipulation. This ambiguity heightens tension, reinforcing the eerie, slow-burning tone of the documentary. The audience is drawn into a layered mystery, questioning whether Mara's influence is extraordinary, inevitable, or a combination of both. The narrative portrays her authority as simultaneously practical, psychological, and symbolic, demonstrating how an individual can subtly reshape a world built to constrain them. The section closes by foreshadowing the consequences of her growing power. Mara's rise does not occur without cost. The jealousy, fear, and resistance she incites set the stage for the eventual unraveling of the old order. Yet her ascent also lays the groundwork for a new form of authority rooted in competence, intellect, and quiet resilience. The summary emphasizes the cinematic tension between anticipation and revelation, showing Mara as a figure who breaks through invisible barriers without dramatic confrontation, leaving the viewer suspended in awe and curiosity. Her transition from overlooked enslaved girl to indispensable, respected leader embodies the central theme of the documentary: the subtle, almost imperceptible power of presence, intelligence, and endurance in the face of systemic oppression. This section chronicles the gradual unraveling of the plantation's traditional hierarchy as Mara's influence becomes impossible to ignore, illustrating the psychological, social, and economic cracks in a system built on rigid control. The change is not immediate, nor is it publicly acknowledged. It unfolds in the shadows, in the spaces where official authority falters and Mara quietly steps in. The narrative opens with an atmosphere of mounting tension. The plantation, once a portrait of austere order and operational predictability, now shows signs of creeping disarray. Mismanaged crop cycles lead to delayed harvesting, the sugar mill begins working off rhythm, livestock records fall out of sync, and disputes among overseers erupt over matters once taken for granted. Each mishap is, on the surface, attributed to incompetence, equipment malfunction, or bad luck, yet time and again, it is Mara's calm logic and foresight that prevent total collapse. Her interventions are not grand spectacles, rather, they are subtle corrections. She reallocates workers to more efficient positions, adjusts planting schedules, balances supplies against seasonal patterns, and redirects wasted efforts with the quiet wisdom of someone who sees patterns others miss. The summary emphasizes the stark contrast between the visible chaos and Mara's composed, effective presence, highlighting how her authority, though unacknowledged by law or title, begins to dictate the functioning of the estate. Every miscalculation by the plantation's leadership magnifies her indispensability. The tension becomes psychological rather than confrontational. It is not strength or status that draws power to her, but an undeniable competence that radiates from the calm precision of her decisions. The section examines the responses of key figures as their control erodes. The plantation owners, accustomed to unquestioned obedience, are caught in a contradiction of dependence and denial. They oscillate between outward denial and reluctant reliance on Mara's counsel, one moment chastising her for speaking beyond her station, the next asking her quietly how best to avert a crisis. Their frustration and fear manifest in erratic behavior. Some attempt to sabotage her influence by assigning impossible tasks, hoping to expose her limitations, others feign disinterest while secretly following her suggestions to stave off disaster. The overseers, whose sense of authority depends on intimidation and compliance rather than skill or knowledge, experience a different kind of breakdown. Their anger stems from a wounded ego. They cannot replicate Mara's insights, yet they refuse to admit their shortcomings. Their anxiety turns inward. They worry not only about the plantation's future, but about their own shrinking relevance. Some resort to petty sabotage, misdirecting workers, falsifying output logs, spreading rumors, yet these acts only accelerate the plantation's dysfunction. Each failure reinforces the contrast between Mara's quiet efficacy and their bluster. The emotional toll of this shift is subtle but profound. The narrative portrays how entrenched power can crumble not through rebellion or confrontation, but through the quiet suffocation of incompetence exposed. In Mara's presence, the old order feels increasingly brittle, not because she challenges it openly, but because she renders it unnecessary. The section also emphasizes the emotional and cultural impact of Mara's rise on the wider community. Enslaved workers, who once moved through their days in fearful obedience, begin to witness small transformations. They see overseers taking her orders without fully realizing they are doing so. They see owners conferring with her behind closed doors. They see problems solved and tensions eased through her guidance. Their reactions range from awe to cautious hope, to whispered recognition that something is shifting beneath the surface. A few brave souls begin to volunteer information or assistance, offering observations about field conditions, weather changes, worker morale, trusting that Mara will use it wisely rather than exploit it. Subtle acts of cooperation begin to shift social dynamics within the plantation. A broken tool is quietly brought to her instead of the overseer. A question about livestock is whispered to her instead of reported through the hierarchy. These gestures are small, nearly invisible, but they accumulate into a quiet, unspoken transfer of loyalty. Meanwhile, rumors begin to spread to neighboring estates and nearby towns. Some cast Mara as a cunning manipulator, others as a visionary, others as something supernatural, a woman touched by luck or prophecy, a force upsetting the natural order. The interplay between perception and reality heightens suspense. Outsiders, lacking first-hand observation, project superstition and fear onto her influence. Insiders experience the tangible shift in daily life. The truth lies somewhere between, a realm where competence wears the disguise of mystique. Historical context underscores the broader implications of the plantation's collapse. Economic pressures tighten across the region. Inspections by agricultural auditors loom. Social expectations, the unspoken code of antebellum hierarchy, demand visible dominance by the white ruling class. Yet these expectations collide with Mara's presence, creating a scenario in which traditional hierarchies cannot survive unchanged. The narrative recounts incidents in which her foresight prevents disaster, recognizing an infestation weeks before visible symptoms, predicting weather shifts by reading atmospheric cues others ignore, averting worker disputes by understanding personal tensions long before they ignite. She restructures the storage of grain to prevent rot. She anticipates shortages and rebalances labor assignments. These interventions, though discreet, accumulate into undeniable evidence of her insight and competence. The narrative emphasizes the deep irony and tension. A young enslaved woman, confined by systemic oppression, becomes the stabilizing force of an estate that would otherwise collapse. Yet her genius is both her power and her prison. The owners cannot openly acknowledge her ability without undermining their system, a system predicated on her supposed inferiority. So her role remains unspoken, almost invisible, a shadow authority. The section concludes by highlighting the psychological resonance of this collapse. The plantation, a microcosm of broader societal structures, illustrates how systems built on fear, domination, and unquestioned hierarchy are shockingly vulnerable to quiet disruption by emotional acuity, intellect, and persistent competence. Mara emerges as a figure whose presence redefines power, not by rebellion, not by confrontation, but by reorienting the axis of dependence. Authority begins to flow toward her naturally, inevitably. She becomes the calm eye in the storm of failing leadership, not elevated by decree, but by necessity. The summary closes with an eerie, contemplative tone, reflecting on how the disintegration of old structures leaves lingering uncertainty. Everyone on the plantation, from the highest owner to the lowest field hand, senses that something irreversible has begun. The stage is set for Mara's transformation from indispensable helper to the symbolic and practical embodiment of a new order, a force of change that alters the psychological terrain long before it reshapes the social one. This section examines the profound transformation of Mara's role on the plantation, from a young enslaved girl confined by the strictures of her society to an indispensable figure whose skills, insight, and calm authority shape the survival and operation of the estate. The narrative opens with a vivid portrayal of daily life under Mara's subtle leadership. She coordinates work schedules, mediates disputes among enslaved laborers, manages food distribution, and oversees critical agricultural decisions. Each task, executed with quiet precision, underscores the contrast between her legal status as property and her functional status as the most capable authority on the grounds. The summary emphasizes the cinematic tension inherent in her dual existence, simultaneously constrained by law yet commanding respect and dependence from those who once held absolute power. The section delves into the psychological dynamics of Mara's influence. The plantation owners, initially resistant to her guidance, gradually rely on her counsel for decisions that affect productivity, social stability, and even financial survival. They experience a complex blend of admiration, unease, and begrudging respect, as they navigate a reality in which their own authority is effectively supplanted by a young woman they legally consider subordinate. Meanwhile, the overseers, whose positions were once defined by intimidation and dominance, find themselves negotiating with Mara, often receiving direction from someone they were conditioned to regard as inferior. This inversion of power underscores the theme of competence surpassing status and illustrates the subtle, almost imperceptible ways in which systemic hierarchies can shift. The narrative explores Mara's interactions with the enslaved community, revealing the layered impact of her authority. Workers who once endured relentless exploitation begin to see her as a stabilizing presence, a figure capable of negotiating both their welfare and the operational needs of the plantation. Mara's guidance is pragmatic yet empathetic, reflecting an understanding of both human psychology and logistical necessity. The summary portrays scenes where her decisions prevent illness outbreaks, allocate resources during times of scarcity, and mediate interpersonal conflicts, creating a fragile but functioning social ecosystem. Each moment reinforces the duality of her existence, legally confined, yet socially indispensable. The section also situates Mara's transformation within the broader social and historical context of the antebellum South. Her rise challenges deeply ingrained norms of race, gender, and class, offering a rare example of a system bending, however reluctantly, around an individual's talent and presence. Local neighbors and regional officials begin to take notice, their interpretations ranging from awe to suspicion. Folklore mingles with fact as rumors of her abilities spread, complicating the historical record and contributing to an aura of near-mythical competence. The tension between perception and reality amplifies the documentary's slow-burning suspense, illustrating how societal structures can be both rigid and malleable depending on circumstance. The summary emphasizes Mara's internal world, portraying her as aware of the precariousness of her position. She exercises restraint, strategic foresight, and emotional intelligence, recognizing that overt assertion of authority could provoke backlash. Her quiet, measured leadership style allows her to navigate systemic oppression while still achieving meaningful influence. The section concludes by reflecting on the profound implications of Mara's journey. Her rise from enslaved labor to essential figure demonstrates the extraordinary power of skill, intellect, and presence in a society designed to suppress autonomy. The narrative leaves viewers contemplating the subtle yet transformative ways individuals can reshape their environment, setting the stage for the final exploration of her enduring legacy. This section examines the extraordinary transformation of Mara's life as she moves from the role of an enslaved girl bound by chains and strict social hierarchies to an indispensable figure whose intelligence, foresight, and calm authority dictate the survival and functioning of the plantation. The narrative begins with a detailed depiction of her daily responsibilities, emphasizing the quiet but relentless competence she displays. Mara oversees the allocation of labor, coordinates planting and harvest schedules, mediates disputes between workers, and manages critical resources such as food and tools. Each action, though subtle, demonstrates a command over operations far beyond what her legal status would allow. The section emphasizes the emotional tension of her dual existence, outwardly bound and submissive, yet functionally indispensable. Mara begins to quietly redefine power within the microcosm of the estate. Cinematically, her movements are described with attention to atmospheric detail, the rhythm of her steps across worn floors, the measured cadence of her voice, and the way others unconsciously defer to her judgment, highlighting the contrast between perception and reality. The narrative explores the psychological dynamics at play. The plantation owners, initially resistant and deeply uncomfortable with her growing influence, gradually recognize that survival and stability increasingly depend on Mara's insight and decision-making. Their responses range from begrudging admiration to simmering unease, as they navigate a world where traditional authority is effectively challenged by a young woman they legally consider property. Overseers, whose authority relied on intimidation, now must operate under Mara's guidance, their positions undermined by her competence and calm decisiveness. This inversion of power not only highlights the fragility of rigid hierarchies but also intensifies the suspense, as viewers witness the slow erosion of control among those who once wielded it without question. The summary underscores that Mara's ascent is not dramatic or violent, it is gradual, measured, and executed with an almost imperceptible mastery, reinforcing the documentary's slow-burning, psychologically resonant tone. The section further delves into Mara's interactions with the enslaved community, illustrating the layered impact of her authority. Workers who once endured relentless hardship begin to see Mara as both a mediator and a stabilizing presence. Her guidance is pragmatic and empathetic, she anticipates challenges, resolves interpersonal conflicts, and ensures the equitable distribution of labor and resources, earning both respect and cautious trust. Specific incidents are reconstructed to showcase her leadership, redirecting labor during a critical planting season to prevent crop failure, mediating disputes between individuals whose tensions threaten productivity, and managing food and water distribution during periods of scarcity. These actions, while pragmatic, also demonstrate emotional intelligence, foresight, and an understanding of human behavior that makes her indispensable to the plantation's functioning. The narrative emphasizes the subtle tension between her legal subordination and her emergent social authority, highlighting the contradictions and complexities of her position. The broader social and historical context is woven throughout this section, highlighting the extraordinary nature of Mara's rise. In a society strictly divided by race, gender, and class, her growing authority challenges entrenched norms. Regional observers, neighboring landowners, and local officials gradually take note of her influence, leading to a mix of awe, suspicion, and whispered speculation. Folklore and rumor begin to surround her, some describe her abilities as uncanny intuition, while others hint at supernatural influence. The documentary underscores the tension between perception and reality, showing how Mara's practical competence becomes entangled with myth and interpretation, further heightening suspense and drawing viewers into a layered historical mystery. The narrative portrays Mara not as a figure of fantasy but as a profoundly real, capable individual whose actions challenge the assumptions and prejudices of her era. Attention is also given to Mara's inner life and strategic awareness. She understands the precariousness of her position and exercises restraint, carefully calibrating her actions to assert authority without provoking backlash. Every decision she makes reflects a deep awareness of social dynamics, human psychology, and operational necessity. The summary describes scenes of quiet observation, Mara noting the moods and patterns of those around her, anticipating potential conflicts, and intervening only when necessary. This strategic subtlety ensures her rise is sustainable and underscores her intelligence, adaptability, and resilience. Through this lens, the audience perceives Mara not only as a survivor but as a transformative presence whose capabilities reshape her environment in ways others cannot fully comprehend. The section also emphasizes the emotional resonance of her journey. Mara's rise from enslaved labor to essential figure serves as a meditation on power, autonomy, and the human spirit. The narrative explores the quiet victories she achieves, the lives she stabilizes, and the influence she exerts without overt confrontation. Her story is framed as both a personal triumph and a social anomaly, highlighting the interplay between individual capability and systemic oppression. Viewers are invited to reflect on how societal structures can be subtly, yet profoundly, transformed through intelligence, presence, and resilience. The section concludes by preparing the audience for the final stage of the narrative, Mara's enduring legacy and the ambiguous, almost mythic imprint she leaves on history. It emphasizes suspense, reflection, and emotional depth, setting the stage for a haunting resolution that balances historical fact with narrative resonance, leaving viewers both enlightened and unsettled. This section explores the final phase of Mara's life and the enduring impact of her extraordinary journey, tracing how a young enslaved girl who once moved in shadows became a figure of subtle but undeniable influence whose story lingers in both documented history and local memory. The narrative begins by examining Mara's later years on the plantation, a time when her authority is no longer contested but quietly accepted. She continues to oversee operations, mediate conflicts, and guide the estate through challenges, yet her presence now carries a weight of historical significance. The section emphasizes the contrast between her outwardly ordinary existence and the extraordinary scope of her influence, creating a cinematic tension that draws viewers into the quiet majesty of her life. The narrative situates Mara as a living embodiment of resilience, intellect, and measured authority, showing how her continued vigilance maintains stability in a world that had once sought to confine her entirely. The summary delves into the societal and psychological reverberations of her legacy. Though legally enslaved, Mara's functional authority transforms the perceptions of those around her. Plantation owners, overseers, and workers alike come to recognize her indispensable role. These changes, though subtle, undermine the established hierarchy, revealing the fragility of systems built on oppression and fear. Mara's ability to navigate complex human dynamics, anticipating needs, resolving disputes, and maintaining operational efficiency, cements her as a stabilizing and guiding force. Through detailed anecdotal reconstruction, the section portrays scenes in which her quiet interventions avert crises, mediate disputes, and influence outcomes that shape not only the plantation but the broader community. Each vignette reinforces the sense that Mara's presence was transformative, a slow and steady force that redefined expectations without overt confrontation. The section also examines how Mara's story enters the realm of folklore and historical ambiguity. Local narratives, passed down through oral tradition, often blur the lines between fact and legend. Neighbors and subsequent generations recall tales of her uncanny insight, her calm authority, and the respect she commanded from all who encountered her. Some accounts exaggerate her abilities, attributing near supernatural prescience to her, while others emphasize her strategic intelligence and emotional acuity. The documentary emphasizes the interplay between these narratives and the fragmented historical record, letters, estate documents, and second-hand accounts, which together create an enigmatic portrait. The audience is encouraged to grapple with uncertainty, reflecting on how history can preserve influence and character even when traditional documentation is incomplete or biased. Mara's legacy is further illuminated through the lens of social and cultural context. Her rise challenges the rigid racial, gender, and social hierarchies of the antebellum South, leaving an imprint that extends beyond the plantation. Scholars and historians who later attempt to piece together her life confront contradictions, gaps, and interpretations that reveal more about the anxieties and aspirations of the society around her than about Mara herself. The narrative emphasizes the tension between systemic oppression and individual agency, showing how one person's intellect, composure, and quiet assertiveness can subtly reshape the social fabric. This analysis situates Mara as both a product of her time and a figure who transcends it, embodying themes of resilience, adaptability, and moral and strategic acumen. Attention is also given to the psychological and emotional resonance of Mara's legacy. The section explores how her influence affected those who lived under her guidance, from workers whose lives she stabilized to overseers and owners whose authority was quietly challenged. Through careful reconstruction, the narrative illustrates how Mara's presence fostered both dependency and respect, transforming interpersonal dynamics and creating an environment in which competence rather than status dictated outcomes. The summary highlights moments of reflection, where individuals recognize the quiet power of her intellect and judgment, acknowledging that her contributions were essential to the survival and functioning of the plantation. These vignettes reinforce the documentary's tone of slow-burning suspense, psychological depth, and emotional resonance. Finally, the section contemplates Mara's enduring enigma. Despite her undeniable influence, she leaves no written memoir, no formal record of triumph, only the subtle traces of a life lived with intelligence, resilience, and strategic awareness. The narrative closes with reflections on the ambiguity of her legacy, how history remembers her, how folklore embellishes her story, and how the gaps in documentation create a haunting resonance. Viewers are left with lingering questions about autonomy, identity, and the hidden forces that shape human lives. Mara's story embodies the tension between documented history and lived experience, leaving an emotional impression that is both awe-inspiring and unsettling. The section culminates in a cinematic meditation on the power of presence, resilience, and quiet authority, framing Mara as a figure whose life transcended chains and whose legacy continues to challenge assumptions about power, capability, and the human spirit. This section serves as the culminating exploration of Mara's life, synthesizing historical fact, folklore, and lingering uncertainties into a reflective and haunting narrative that leaves viewers contemplating the depth and complexity of her extraordinary journey. The narrative begins by revisiting the trajectory of Mara's life in detail, from her early existence as an enslaved girl confined by brutal social hierarchies, to the subtle rise of her authority within the plantation, to her transformation into a figure whose intelligence, foresight, and calm presence stabilized the estate. The summary emphasizes the contrast between the documented facts of her life and the mythologized accounts that grew in parallel, highlighting the tension between reality and perception. The cinematic tone is contemplative, almost spectral, inviting viewers to peer into a life that simultaneously existed within rigid constraints and transcended them, leaving echoes that would resonate long after her death. The section delves deeply into the interpretations that historians, folklorists, and local chroniclers have offered over time. Some scholars focus on Mara's intellectual and strategic abilities, portraying her as a model of exceptional competence who, through calm reasoning and emotional intelligence, redefined authority in a society structured to suppress her. These interpretations frame her life as a case study in individual agency, illustrating how skill, observation, and resilience can allow a single person to influence entrenched systems subtly but profoundly. Other perspectives emphasize the cultural and psychological dimensions of her story, highlighting how the combination of her unusual abilities, her calm demeanor, and the anxieties of those around her created fertile ground for legends to form. Local communities, observing her quiet authority, began to narrativize her actions, blending admiration, fear, and superstition into stories that blurred the line between fact and myth. This duality of perception versus reality underscores the enigmatic quality of Mara's life, showing how human memory and interpretation can transform lived experience into legend. The section examines in detail the inconsistencies and gaps in historical evidence, which deepen the mystery surrounding Mara. Estate records, letters, and oral accounts often contradict each other, leaving the exact sequence and impact of her actions open to interpretation. Some reports suggest she was involved in strategic decisions that a young enslaved girl would never have been expected to influence, while others depict her simply observing events unfold with quiet composure. These contradictions highlight the difficulty of reconstructing the life of someone whose authority existed largely outside formal recognition. The narrative emphasizes that these gaps do not diminish her influence, rather, they amplify the intrigue and suspense, reflecting both the limitations of historical documentation and the extraordinary subtlety with which she navigated her world. The documentary examines these sources critically, weighing the reliability of each while acknowledging the impossibility of absolute certainty, creating a rich tapestry of ambiguity that engages the audience intellectually and emotionally. Mara's social impact is explored in both micro and macro terms. Within the plantation, her authority redefined relationships between enslaved workers, overseers, and owners, creating a delicate ecosystem in which competence and foresight supplanted formal rank. The narrative reconstructs scenes where her guidance prevented conflict, optimized labor efficiency, and maintained resource balance, showing that her influence was both practical and psychological. Beyond the estate, local observers, neighbors, and regional officials began to interpret her abilities through the lens of superstition, religion, and local lore, weaving her story into a broader social consciousness. The summary highlights how these interpretations, sometimes reverential, sometimes fearful, extended her influence beyond her immediate environment, allowing her life to resonate across time and geography in ways that documented history alone cannot capture. The section further explores the interplay between Mara's legacy and broader societal structures. In a world defined by rigid racial, gender, and class hierarchies, her rise subtly challenged the foundational assumptions of authority and competence. Her existence disrupted expectations, forcing observers to reconcile the legal status of enslaved persons with the undeniable reality of her influence. These contradictions underscore a central theme of the documentary: the tension between systemic oppression and individual capability. By presenting Mara as a figure who operated within, yet subtly transcended, these constraints, the narrative encourages viewers to reflect on the complexity of historical power dynamics and the ways in which extraordinary individuals can subtly reshape entrenched systems. Psychological and emotional dimensions are central to understanding Mara's unresolved legacy. The documentary emphasizes the nuanced ways in which she influenced the human lives around her: workers who gained a measure of stability, overseers whose authority was quietly recalibrated, and owners who grappled with unease and reluctant dependence. Each interaction is reconstructed with attention to detail, illustrating how her presence fostered both respect and subtle tension. Mara's calm decisiveness, strategic foresight, and measured interventions created an environment in which competence and observation dictated outcomes, leaving a profound psychological imprint on everyone she encountered. This nuanced portrayal reinforces the documentary's slow-burning, contemplative tone, highlighting the quiet power of presence and intelligence in shaping social dynamics. The section also examines how folklore, myth, and historical record intermingle to preserve Mara's story while complicating interpretation. Over time, her life became the subject of stories that blurred the line between reality and imagination. Some narratives emphasize near-supernatural insight, while others focus on her extraordinary resilience and intellect. The documentary situates these stories alongside surviving historical documents, letters, and estate records, creating a layered portrait in which fact and legend coexist. This interplay underscores the enigmatic quality of her legacy. Mara's influence is undeniable, yet the precise details of her life remain elusive, inviting viewers to engage with the mystery rather than seek definitive answers. The narrative emphasizes the emotional resonance of this ambiguity, creating a lingering sense of awe and contemplation. The final portion of the section invites reflection on the unresolved questions that continue to surround Mara's life. What enabled her extraordinary foresight and composure? How much of the legend reflects reality, and how much is a projection of societal fears and admiration? In what ways did her quiet interventions alter the trajectory of the plantation and the lives of those around her, in ways history may never fully capture? The narrative frames these questions without offering definitive answers, emphasizing the power of ambiguity and the human fascination with stories that defy simple explanation. Viewers are encouraged to consider the broader implications of Mara's life, reflecting on how extraordinary individuals can challenge societal expectations, reshape perceptions, and leave legacies that endure even in the absence of full documentation. The section concludes with a reflective meditation on Mara's enduring significance. Her story exemplifies the tension between recorded history and lived experience, demonstrating that influence, resilience, and quiet authority can persist even when legal or social recognition is absent. Cinematically, the narrative closes with evocative imagery: empty plantation fields at dawn, the faint rustle of wine through the trees, and shadows of figures long gone, an atmospheric reminder that the traces of Mara's life remain, haunting, unresolved, and profoundly human. The documentary leaves viewers with a sense of contemplation and wonder, highlighting the enduring mystery of a woman who refused to be confined by chains, whose intellect and presence subtly reshaped the world around her, and whose legacy continues to challenge assumptions about power, agency, and historical memory. The final moments linger on questions rather than answers, reinforcing the slow-burning, emotionally resonant tone and leaving audiences suspended between admiration, uncertainty, and awe.